What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a Pillars of Eternity lore video, this time about the god Berath. So, just a quick couple things. One, gonna be some spoilers for the games, specifically some in-game stuff for the first game, as well as some of the, tiny bits of plot towards the beginning, actually, of the second game. But with that out of the way, let's talk about Berath. Now, Berath is known as the god of life and death, cycles, doors, portals even in some cases, but basically transitioning from one thing to another. Specifically, Berath is kind of the representation of the wheel in god form. So if you're unaware, in this universe, life and death is called the wheel, and it's a cycle of reincarnation in which souls die, go to the beyond eventually, and are reborn into new bodies. Berath oversees that process. That's like her job, and thus is seen as kind of the god of life and death, just overall. Now, she takes many forms, actually. Now, primarily, to us, the watcher in the second game, as well as the first, she uses a female's voice, as well as a avatar called the Pallid Knight, which is a very gaunt, milk-skinned, bony woman in giant, massive black armor with a greatsword. But assigning a gender to Berath would technically be incorrect, because Berath is also known to take the form of the Usher, which is an incredibly wrinkled old man who kind of subtly pushes people into situations that will kill them. And we see this a lot throughout everything we know about Berath, because Berath is one of the gods that's actually represented differently throughout each culture. And supposedly, this is because she has appeared to each culture differently. For instance, the Huana in Deadfire actually depict Berath as a twinned eel, which represents Berath's twinned nature. But the one we see used the most are the two avatars of the Pallid Knight and the Usher. That said, again, she appears to us primarily as the Pallid Knight. And, just as a fun fact, the big iconic statues from the first game that we see outside Leoban Relag or something, I don't know how it's pronounced, but that is actually a mural of Berath, because the most common forms of respect to Berath are to put idols or carvings of Berath in or around doorways or next to portals or just anything that would take you from one place to another, really, which is why we see that. Now, it is worth mentioning, though, in terms of a priesthood, Berath doesn't really have one. Berath does have a small one, technically, and you will see them around occasionally. But the reason for this is because Berath rarely speaks to followers at all. Occasionally. Very occasionally. For instance, you can find research of Berath's teachings where the key is there is life and death, and there is death and life. Essentially teaching that there is duality to all things. Now, in the first game, when you get towards the end of it in Act 3 and you have to talk to the gods, each of them has a side quest for you to earn their favor. Now, Berath's quest, because Berath is actually the small group of gods you speak to when you do that particular quest, asks you to kill two people that have cheated death. Basically, they've lived too long through supernatural means, and Berath needs you to put an end to it. Now, you don't actually have to fight them to death. You can convince them to do the right thing. But basically, they're using supernatural means to live longer than they should. And when you get to the end of Pillars of Eternity, Berath wants the souls of the Hollowborn children sent back to the wheel, which is kind of like the crux of that game's plot, but we're not going to get into that too much. But I just want to mention that Berath wants all of those souls sent back to the wheel. Whereas a god like Hylia, for instance, wants the souls primarily returned to the children they belong to. Which I find interesting, because that ending kind of implies that the souls that would go to children who just aren't around anymore, for instance, that body is gone, it's implied that those souls would actually go back to the wheel anyway. So it would occur to me that the best ending in terms of this situation would be to send the souls that will go to children whose bodies somehow made it through the crisis back to them, whereas the souls of children that had turned into wykes or just didn't survive, those souls would go back to the wheel. That would make the most sense in my opinion, which is basically Hylia's ending, and is certainly what gets implied. But nonetheless, Berath just wants all the souls returned to the wheel altogether. And then in the second game, Berath of course greets us, as you've probably seen in this video already, after our untimely death of sorts at Cad Nua after Eothas rose from his proverbial grave. And we become Berath's herald. The Pallid Knight will grant us a chime of sorts, which is kind of like a metaphysical thing that she plants in our body, basically to compel us to actually chase after Eothas, as well as contact us. And then, like all the other gods, we see the Pallid Knight in several of the conversations that are going on as the game progresses. Though truthfully, we don't actually interact with them that much, and it feels like those conversations are just designed to move the plot as they don't really do or affect anything. But with those things out of the way, let's talk more about the forms that Berath chooses to take, specifically the Pallid Knight and the Usher, because you can find some text here and there that will tell you about them. And take it with a grain of salt, because while you can find it in-game, it's worth mentioning that the gods aren't supposed to directly interfere with mortals, not like show up in avatar form and do it, which is why these stories I'm about to tell you are particularly interesting to me. Because there is a legend, I suppose you could say, where when it's time for a specific person to die, Berath will show up as the Pallid Knight waiting in the middle of the road to challenge said person, warrior, whatever they happen to be, to combat. If they accept that challenge, they will of course die because they're fighting a literal god. However, if they turn and run and refuse it, they'll shortly thereafter run into the Usher. And the Usher will subtly lead them into an accident that causes their death, which sounds really cool. But again, gods aren't supposed to do that, which is to say directly involved. So I'm curious if these are just legends that have survived from the time before gods made that pact with each other, because that is a thing, and would be my best assumption by all means. But with that out of the way, that's pretty much everything we know about Berath. Probably one of the cooler gods aesthetically, as well as the domains that Berath has available to them. With that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. Truly, I really do appreciate it. The channel's growing every day, and I couldn't do it without you guys, so thank you. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.